Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from today. I'm Shomy Chowdhury, a young advocate and practitioner from Bangladesh, the co-founder of Awareness 360 and one of the young leaders for the Generation 17 initiative, which is supported by Samsung and the United Nations Development Programme. We are here today for a special edition of the Act for SDGs Turning Point Dialogue series. As millions of people mobilize across the world for sustainable development goals and climate action, we are here to unpack what it will take to keep the promise of the Sustainable Development Goals and ensure an equal, fair, green, and just post-COVID world, whilst reversing the setbacks due to COVID-19. Joining me here today on the 6th anniversary of the SDGs, we have a very special guest, the Administrator of the UN Development Programme, UNDP, Achim Steiner. Welcome, Achim. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, Shomy, and very happy to be with you. Thanks for having me on the program and a good chance to discuss with you something that we should be celebrating on the 6th anniversary.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I know it's a very busy week for you, so I really appreciate you taking the time to join this conversation. So without any further delay, I'm going to dive right into our conversation. Well, for the audience, we are here to talk about the power and opportunity and the necessity of this moment as a turning point for people and for the planet. Now, today marks a special anniversary. It's been 6 years since the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. And this agreement was one of optimism, hope, and a plan to end inequalities and injustice, leave no one behind, and drive ambition towards a future where every person can thrive whilst living within the bounds of our planet. And the 2030 Agenda also recognized the role young people played as critical agents of change. Now, since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the impacts on hard-won development gains are undeniable, right? Like we didn't really predict this pandemic, and there's too much going on to tackle right now. Now, Achim, my question to you is, how can we reverse the damage that has been done? And what must we prioritize now to ensure that our shared future is one of progress and not regress?
Well, Shomy, my answer is going to be one of many shades of reality. So as you were speaking and you were saying 6 years ago in the General Assembly Hall, the SDGs were adopted, and I'm looking from my window down on First Avenue because the UN General Assembly week is just beginning, and in some ways it's a sad moment because I was attending an event this morning in the General Assembly Hall, and there's hardly anybody who can be in the hall of the General Assembly, which is a complete contrast to that extraordinary moment in the year 2015 when the world came together despite all the differences, despite all the conflicts and sometimes ideological divisions. And we actually agreed on a plan. We agreed on the 2030 Agenda. We agreed on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And, to many, I know out there, it often is that, at the United Nations, people set goals, nobody pays attention to them. But that's actually not true. Just last week, I was reminded about an extraordinary achievement, which is essentially dealing with the ozone layer, or rather the hole that had, been found in the ozone layer in the 60s. And then, the United Nations brokered the Vienna Convention, the Montreal Protocol, and the world came together and actually phased out ozone-depleting substances. People often forget these extraordinary moments when, as I call it, often we do something despite our differences because it is in our common interest. So from here on onwards, we're obviously in the middle of a pandemic. So to talk about something aspirational like the SDGs, which with their targets and indicators are actually quite specific, may seem a little bit strange to people, but let me say to you, it is precisely because of the moment we're in that we need to have this conversation. You lead an organization called Awareness 360. Essentially, the SDGs are another attempt to create a 360 perspective on what is happening around us and where we locate ourselves as individuals, as nations, as communities, and also how we need to tackle these challenges. Now, some people might say the pandemic is a virus, it's a health problem. Actually, it is, but it's also in the way that impacts people a product of inequality. The origins of it also related to an unsustainable way in which we have practiced land use, in which we are creating more and more opportunities for diseases that normally circulate amongst animals to jump over into humans. So, in a way, the starting point has to be to embrace the moment in time that we live in, which is a world that is 7, soon 8 billion people, a planet that is under stress, an economy that has delivered a lot of wealth. In fact, the world today is the wealthiest it has ever been in financial terms. 400 and something trillion dollars is the wealth that has been accumulated. Now, to implement the SDGs, for example, the estimate is that we would need roughly maybe 4.2 trillion a year. That's 1.1% of the total global wealth. Now, why do I say this? Because people often say, oh, it's impossible and these goals are not achievable. Well, we've just seen many countries do something exactly in an opposite way. They set up social protection systems. They set up digital schooling. They set up temporary basic incomes. They developed a new vaccine. They actually, are now struggling to take it all over the world. But, a year from now, hopefully, much of the world will have been, in a sense, put in a position where it could actually recover from this pandemic. And herein lies perhaps the most concrete way of thinking forward. If we don't now embrace this moment and think about doing things differently, and I'll just home in on two areas. Inequality. This pandemic has shown how painful it is to be poor, or how expensive it is to be poor in a world where, access to vaccines, to protective equipment, to medical support depends on money. And even at this moment, we are not succeeding in having vaccine equity across the world. And secondly, we have the challenge of sustainability. Is it really sensible for our politicians and economic leaders to now take us back to the world of 2018, 2019, carbon emissions going up, air pollution killing 7 million people a year prematurely? No, it's not. And we have alternatives. We had to develop a vaccine in order to deal with the pandemic. There is no vaccine for climate change, but there are many solutions that are already working across the world. So it requires us all to embrace the opportunity to act differently. Thinking forward right now is as much about eradicating poverty as it is to transition to a low carbon and net zero emissions economy in the next decades. These things are all connected, but that doesn't mean that they are too complex or too complicated to deal with. So to anybody who is listening this morning, don't buy anyone's story that there's nothing that can be done. That is the greatest, in a sense, misleading statement that people have tried to use over history time and again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Achim. I think you very rightly pointed that COVID-19 has really exacerbated the inequality that already existed, and it's really time for all of us, not just one particular stakeholder, but all of us, to really work on these global goals. And if we take collective measures, collective actions, it's definitely possible to achieve the SDGs that might seem a bit too ambitious to many. Thank you again. And these are really some bold actions that need to be taken. But the question is, how can we get there, right? So what is UNDP doing to help realize this vision, Achim?
Well, as an organization that works in 170 countries, inevitably there are many different things that we try to support countries with at their request. Being a development program and being very much focused on helping countries also to implement the SDGs as the 2030 agenda offered them, an integrated approach, first of all, of thinking about development, and secondly, also an approach that recognizes that what the rich world does will also influence what is possible to be done in the poorer world, in inverted commas. We can call them developing countries, North and South. I mean, there are many ways to describe an unequal world. And our objective is principally to help countries to actually develop their societies, their economies, their communities in a way that allows them to fulfill their capacities. UNDP has been, at the forefront of framing this notion of human development. Over 30 years ago, the UNDP Human Development Report was created for the first time to challenge this notion that, development is all about income. Therefore, GDP growth, per capita incomes are how you measure a country's well-being. And my predecessors, many years ago said, no, this is too narrow. And so they came up with the Human Development Index, and they looked at also education and health as another way of measuring a country's well-being. So in today's world, we are particularly focused on what we call an SDG push. There are people who, are now saying, well, we have had so many setbacks with the pandemic, the SDGs are no longer relevant. Well, UNDP unapologetically says the opposite is true. SDGs are a way of thinking about development, addressing and tackling issues not in isolation from one another. Now, sometimes that may involve literally dealing with social protection. How do we help countries to establish temporary basic incomes? For instance, in the lockdowns, the informal sector workers have no social protection. They have no unemployment benefit. So governments quickly had to find a way in which they could get money to the poorest in order for them to be able to survive the closing down of markets. But it may at the same time be the advent of a new technology, digitalization. I've tried very hard to make UNDP as much about addressing the future of development in terms of opportunities as the history of development in terms of the legacies that it has left behind. And digitalization is a classic area. We are helping many countries now to develop national digitalization approaches and strategies that are more inclusive, where the rights of the individual are protected, but also technology investments, support in education and curricular syllabuses are developed in such a way that young people who leave school can actually enter into this digital universe and use the extraordinary opportunities it presents. So as the UN Development Programme, the SDGs are our brief, if you want, but at the end of the day, it is very much what happens in a country. That's where countries prioritize their requests to us. And at times it may be about how to, for instance, establish a protected area, how to manage the financing of conservation, or how to promote the investment in renewable energy infrastructure, because that is the country's priority. So it's across that full spectrum that we support with many partners in the UN family, but also outside, investments, planning, better policies, and ultimately, hopefully, a more sustainable development.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Achim. I totally agree that SDGs really could not be more relevant than what it is today. And the work that UNDP is doing is incredible, and its contribution is really undeniable. So thank you again for leading the work that UNDP does. Now, when we talk about big terms like the SDGs and the United Nations and UNDP and things like that, oftentimes people can't relate, and they sort of think that there's a stereotype like, oh, these are not for me, these are more like for the government, the head of states, the world leaders, etc., the policymakers. So many people watching at home today, like individuals, they might not be aware of the action that they can take as an individual to support this transformation. So what would be your call to action for anyone who wants to play their part to make this vision a reality?
It's a very good point, Shomy. And I sometimes feel, in a sense, frustrated that to so many who, look into the United Nations from outside, somewhere around the world, what we sometimes see may seem distant, partly because, trying to bring together 7 billion people, over 190 nations in one place, and then agree on what to do is a remarkably difficult thing. I mean, just look around your community, start with your family, look at your school class. Just amongst 10, 20, 30 people, it's so easy to disagree about, minor things that become major issues. So the United Nations inevitably sometimes seems distant, and yes, sometimes it is also abstract. But, the Sustainable Development Goals, just to, end on that point, is in many ways quite a remarkable breakthrough, because they identified 17 areas that the Secretary General at the time, Ban Ki-moon, called a declaration of interdependence. So take these goals, first of all, as something that allows every nation, every community, every citizen to find the reality that they see around themselves reflected in the SDGs. Now, here is the point to an individual. You don't have to immediately, work on all 17 SDGs. Not even governments do that necessarily all the time. I think the starting point for any individual, and whether you're 5, 10, 15, or 50 years old, is what you care about. Most of us begin to think about what's happening around us because we see something that we either really appreciate or that really is, very frustrating to watch. Pain, inequality, injustice, but also the inspirations of whether it's people like Mahatma Gandhi or Nelson Mandela or Wangari Maathai or, just people in your community. Not everybody who is inspiring becomes famous. You've got to find something that makes you get up in the morning and want you to do something about it. So I think that's the most important thing. You can then call it an action that is related to SDG 1 or SDG 17 or SDG 5. You may care about climate change, about gender, about access to clean energy. The most important thing is to find something that you care about, because that's what makes you both believe in yourself as a change agent, but it also gives you focus. And then you start networking. And people often forget that the greatest ideas in human history always started with one person. I mean, this is the truth, right? So whether it is Steve Jobs with Apple Computers, or whether it was Wangari Maathai, who in Kenya began to say, look, we've got to do something about injustice here, about ecological degradation. I'm going to mobilize women to plant trees. And with planting trees, we create peace in our community. And she ended up being a world famous leader, winning the Nobel Peace Prize, right? Who would have thought that at the time she was actually, even beaten up because she was protesting against the destruction of nature in her country. So to young people, to old people, to men, women, boys, girls, find what you care about and then start networking, start finding others who are doing perhaps similar work or who want to do something about it. And before you know it, you have a mini movement. And before you know it, you may actually impact what happens next, whether in your community, in your country, or even in the world. And that is the way to be more than just a passive observer. I think sometimes the saddest thing that can happen to us is that we feel totally disempowered, and therefore we feel there's nothing we can do. And I think that's why I would say to anyone, listen to what makes you passionate about something, and then start from there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Achim. You've really framed the SDGs in a very relatable way, and it's so important to contextualize these global goals into our local context and how what we care about. It's really not about solving the whole problems, like the entire SDGs, achieving them at once, but really looking into it and breaking them down and doing it all together. Thank you again, Achim, and thank you so much for joining us for this inspiring conversation. Now, over almost 3 decades, you have been a global leader on sustainable development, on climate resilience and international cooperation. You're such a role model for us young people, but we now want to understand what inspires you, not as Administrator Achim, but as person Achim. Like, can you tell us about an experience, a person, a project, a book, a movie, or a piece of art that may have inspired you to become who you are today?
Well, I think the easiest way to describe what inspires me is actually people around me. I find that, whether it's ideas, whether it's learning about something, when you meet someone who, triggers your imagination and inspires you to become involved or to care about something. So when I was a student, I very much followed, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And one of my most memorable moments was when Nelson Mandela finally, was released, and I was still a student in London. And I went to this football stadium called Wembley Stadium. Probably football fans all over the world will know it. Others may not know it. It's in London. It's a big stadium, and it was a concert for Nelson Mandela. And, it had Tracy Chapman in it and many, many artists from all over the world. And I was fascinated by how one man who had been locked in a prison for 27 years would walk into that stadium with his life history and electrify 80,000 people. There were 80,000 people in that stadium. And to me, it was one of those moments when you realize, nobody had met Nelson Mandela in that stadium, yet everybody felt some affinity for what he stood for, what he represented, how he spoke. So I think people matter in what I do, and that is why I chose a profession. And by the way, you said I'm a leader for 30 years. When I began, I was no leader at all. I was a junior professional officer. I was a volunteer. When I left university, I actually spent a year as a kind of apprentice with an Indian NGO also. My journey was one of increasingly being inspired by people who prove that you can change things and learning how to mobilize others to do so. And then, as you go through that journey, life will sometimes present you with opportunities that you never thought of. I never thought I would join the United Nations. I always believed in it. I loved the idea of it, as we all do. But it was a very distant thing until one day I received a phone call and, they asked me, would you be interested in joining the United Nations? And, when I first walked into the Secretariat, the headquarters of the United Nations here in New York, there is a wonderful sculpture there, the Knotted Gun it's called. I actually mentioned that, you remember, in that TED talk that we did some time ago. And, when I saw that sculpture, it actually, to me, represents this extraordinarily powerful idea of the United Nations. We, as human beings, we seem to have a propensity to find 1,000 reasons to argue with one another and then to fight with one another and unleash enormous destruction, grief, and pain. That knotted gun is such a powerful symbol for what is the idea behind the United Nations. And so, a good decade and a half later, I'm still working for the United Nations, in part because I believe deeply in the power of that idea that led people to set it up at the time. So, whether it's an idea or whether it's persons or individuals, those are the things that make me kind of get both inspired, but also energized to try and, despite all the reasons why things go wrong. When you lead an organization like UNDP, I have responsibility now for close to 20,000 people working in 170 countries. A lot of what I do every day is very far away from the knotted gun idea, or indeed from where Nelson Mandela was talking about the future of South African humanity. But, when you connect that which you do every day with the possibility of actually contributing to that idea succeeding, then you get up and you have a reason to go to work. And I am very lucky because I've really never had a day when I didn't have that reason to get up in the morning and go to work, even though sometimes I come home in the evening very frustrated. So that's all part of it.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much. That was so beautiful and very powerful indeed. Thank you again, Achim. I guess that is the end of our conversation today. Thank you for sharing your time and insights with us. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today, Achim.
Thank you so much. Very good to be with you, Shomy, and see you somewhere else soon, I hope.
Thank you. I hope so as well. To our lovely audience, thank you for joining us for this important conversation as we mobilize for the Global Week to act for SDGs, to turn it around for people and planet together. Join the action from wherever you are and register what you're doing at actforsdgs.org. Thank you.